One of the things that I was actually going to follow up with you on was this Quillette podcast where they were
Yeah, let's.
interviewing a guy talking about Chernobyl TV series, and it sounds like he really put a damper on your excitement for the show, did he?
Yeah, definitely to some degree because it's undeniably a really good show, a really put together show. But I think like a big part of the impact was the notion that it was true.
Hmm.
I was learning about this incident, this disaster that happened within my lifetime,
Right.
and how much worse it could have been. So that is kind of somewhat taken away, or at least reduced, and it's hard to say how much. I expect shows to take artistic liberties, so that's not a problem
Hmm.
if they want to exaggerate things for effect. But it does seem like that Michael Shellenberger in that interview pointed out like they went beyond that with their claims that they said no, this is based in reality. Here are some facts, and then
Mm-hmm.
even at the end they put those facts in text at the end, which is where you typically like you tie your artistic take to what actually happened in real life, and they were still saying X happened, Y happens, Z happened. That apparently now I'm not so sure.
Well, like the examples that he brought up, like I didn't find them particularly compelling because I agree that I think it's clear that the show has taken artistic liberties. Anyone who's done any research on the subject will notice the scene with the helicopter, for example, was not really caused by the radiation. And I'm sure there were other things that happened like that as well. But like for example, the bit where he is talking about the firefighter's wife and her baby dying
Yeah,
after the fact. That actually did happen. Now, whether that death was directly a cause of radiation, I think is up for debate, but the baby died of cirrhosis of liver. So there is a and it's not unreasonable to assume, like if you think about how toxicity travels in living organisms, right? If you are, why are pregnant women prohibited from drinking alcohol and things like that? If you take in some kind of poison, it will find its way to the baby. That's sort of the whole issue. And to think that somehow radiation would avoid that direction or somehow behave differently, like I don't see why that would be the case.
but didn't Schellenberger cite medical knowledge on that? Like, didn't he say that is medical consensus that that's just not how it works? The radiation exposure wouldn't radiation exposure of the mother wouldn't subsequently go to the fetus.
Um, that that is possible. That again, like I don't know what the consensus is medically speaking, but when he talked about the actual situation with the baby, he said like, "Oh, we don't know if there was a baby. We don't know if it died." Like, yeah, we do. Like that is actually documented evidence. It was a real person with a real baby who passed away. Now again, whether it had
Hmm.
some direct link to it being radiation related, that's a fair question. And so yeah, I mean that can be looked into further.
Hmm.
But but he seemed to be kind of casually dismissive of the whole thing. And
Huh.
that's sort of the general gist of how he tried to paint his view of the events. It sort of seems to me like he was taking things that were questionable and painting them as factual, and taking things that were factual and painting them as questionable. For example, like he was saying like, oh, I don't know if there was a baby, I don't know what happened there, we are not sure. Like we are sure actually of the baby and the death, and that was a matter of fact. Causality of it, sure, could be explored further. But then he would talk about how they've then identified that there was a scientific study done about the actual the actual consequences of the disaster, right, and how it had health impact on the population, right? So there were like 32 or something people that actually died as a direct result of the explosion and exposure, and then there was a lot of thyroid cancers in children. Well, I think it's really interesting that he would, first of all, that you would, this Chernobyl area is just surrounded by a bunch of villages. To think that people were collecting prior to the disaster, collecting detailed health information about all the possible things that you would need to establish a proper baseline, I think would be an error to think that, and then to think that after the fact, I imagine they started collecting that data, but to then believe blindly that the Soviet government wouldn't try to falsify it and doctor that evidence seems to me a little naive as well.
Hmm.
And so like he's just sort of like saying like, oh, there were like whatever 20,000 thyroid cancers with a mortality rate of 1%, and so we have the exact data here, here, and here. This is what happened, and I don't think this is clear cut a picture as he's trying to make it out to be. And then he's talking about how they were trying to make it seem like it was going to be some kind of that is akin to a nuclear explosion or something like that, and I didn't see that part of it at all. Like, I mean, it was painted as an accident, which is what it was. Of course, there are dangers, and of course, and talking about the actual amount of radiation that leaked, I do believe that it was higher than the amount of radiation that leaked during the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because those bombs did not actually, the radiation was not what killed people. They were killed by the explosive wave because of the power of the sheer power of the explosion itself. The radiation was fairly mild, if I understand it correctly. Again, I may be wrong about this, but he seemed a little paranoid to me about thinking that this movie set out to paint his industries in a negative light. I think
Well,
I don't think that's a fair assessment.
let's let me just pick on that point for a second. Is it his industry? Does he work for the nuclear industry?
Well, he certainly was very butthurt about it. Like I don't know.
We should check on that before we like assign like presume that
Well,
he works for a
wasn't the
nuclear
whole
company or
point of
something.
the interview was that he was supposed to be like a nuclear energy expert?
Oh, maybe. I think. Well, obviously, yeah. He seemed to be someone who had knowledge in the field,
Right.
but like you would hope that there are people who are not like actually paid by the nuclear companies or whatever, like that have knowledge in that field, because how
Right.
else are we going to get information?
No, like I mean,
Yeah, that
sure.
that would be an important thing, which I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure who he is, but yeah. So there's always that part, which is like, should we start by questioning, who does this person represent? But he may or may not. Like, he might just be an opinionated guy. He could be an independent academic who just, his opinion falls on this one side, and some people are just passionate about them. So, all those things seem like reasonable objections from you. I'm more puzzled than ever now. Is it a question of sources, like which sources of information you're looking at versus him? Because you seem to be like drawing different conclusions from each other about like what was legitimate, what is true and what isn't. Like
Well,
the fact of whether this lady died or not. He's saying we don't know whether there was a lady with a kid that died.
well, I mean that's part of the problem. Like it does look like he took the part of it that says like, oh, the radiation traveled to the baby, and he dismissed the story as a whole instead of actually finding out what happened. And what happened is the baby did die. Uh, whether it was radiation related directly or not, I'm not sure. But what also is a matter of record, public record, is that when that woman kind of bribed her way into that hospital to see her injured husband, she was asked by the head nurse or whoever the person in charge was, like whether she already had children. The implication being that if you don't, you shouldn't be here because you won't be able to have any more. Like, again, that's not to say that this is. Here's another thing, like, like the movie was portraying people's understanding of the subject matter at the time. It is not to say that
Hmm.
it was a correct understanding, but people
Yes.
had irrational fears of it, and those irrational fears gotta be displayed because actually maybe they should have had more irrational fears because fewer people may have died as a result. So that's that is something that I think is important to mention.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I think that would be fine. What concerns me more is like the hard, uh, the hard numbers and things that they claim. And I don't know who's right here because I haven't looked at these studies that he was citing. But I think he was citing like international studies as well, so that he was trying to clear the air that he's not just following the Soviet propaganda, and he was citing studies from some international agency that went in there. But
Right.
what about the like the claims at the end that would concern me are like the bridge of death claim, for example, where they said at the end they put out in text something like all of the people who stood on the bridge that night died within 3 months or something like that. Um, and apparently there's no evidence of this.
Hmm.
Like that is a potentially an urban legend.
So yeah,
Um,
if if they made a claim that was factually incorrect, then I think that that's not cool. Certainly not in the ending credits where people expect to see you know actual information. But I don't
yeah,
remember them saying that. I'd have to check, but I mean, certainly the implication was there just from the the in the first episode or whatever when that was happening. It they painted it as a very deathly scenario. Whether it turned out to be that way or not
yeah.
is I'm not sure.
Yeah, that was one, and those people on the bridge were some distance away from it, and then I think he also said that, like, well, in the show they portrayed all the firefighters as having died these like grotesque deaths. I believe this guy claims that only one firefighter died of the bunch, and most of them lived. And in the show, they go through this whole transformation into these mutant-looking creatures, which I also took to be as a depiction of how people die of radiation poisoning. But he's saying, no, you don't go through all that. Your skin looks burned, like you look like you have a sunburn, but that's what you don't turn into this weird person where it's melting off and all of that.
Well,
Which,
that sounds like that was minimization on his part because there were definitely a number of firefighters who died. What he
oh
was
yeah,
saying actually also he said that they were dying of part of the reason that some of them died was because there was the radiation poisoning on top of the fact that they also received burns. But my understanding is that the burns they received were the radiation burns. I don't think they were professional firefighters. They're not gonna
mm,
get burnt by a fire that is, like they're just. It seems like a stupid thing to do. Certainly not in an open environment like that. Um, so, um, so yeah, like it just seems like he's made up his mind about some of these things, and then you know, he's doing the very same thing that he's accusing the show of doing, is playing fast and loose with the facts. And
mm,
I, I just, like I wish that, like if he had criticism, and I think there are legitimate criticisms to bring up, but I don't think that they amount to like a complete dismissal of the show as some sort of propaganda machine for the, against nuclear energy.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. Now I'm not sure where the truth lies. Now I'm gonna have to assume by default that maybe the truth is somewhere in between.
Perhaps it is. Perhaps it's
Yeah,
somewhere hiding.
but you seem to have researched this a little more than me, so yeah, I trust your sense that he has overplayed his case, and yeah, maybe the show is not so lowered as I had thought. Somewhere in between.
Well, I don't know. For me, like the way that I look at it anyway is that, and I think I've mentioned it in the message I sent you too, is that it seems that this show has rubbed a bunch of people the wrong way. Like there is the Putin's government seems to be unhappy with it. There is the nuclear power industry people seem to be unhappy with it. There is the Russian cinema people seem to be unhappy with it. Some of it, I think, is just paranoia and being just uh, feeling aggrieved by some imagined slights against them. Because like the way that I see this is just that it's a film about truth and lies and about bravery and courage and cowardice and those things they exist everywhere, and so it just
Yeah,
happens to be a story about this event, but I think I think that's
that's
necessarily is going to bring up some people who are in any way invested into either covering things up or upholding their image in a certain light.
yeah, that's fair.
They're going to be sensitive.
But can you imagine though? Because this sort of brings up another point where it does sound like they may have been being unfair. You can tell me that in the 1980s they weren't executing people. They weren't still executing people for slight deviations from official party doctrine. Like these guys were all worried that they were going to be executed. And Shellenberger says you're going back decades when that was happening in the Soviet Union. So
Well,
is that a historical misrepresentation?
there was definitely, I think they've overplayed some of the elements of intimidation there, and for example, I think when the guys, the coal minister showed up to recruit the miners to go dig the tunnel. Apparently, they interviewed actual miners who were there, and they're like, yeah, nobody was there with AKs trying to threaten us. It was a fairly voluntary operation. Um,
Okay.
so so that certainly wasn't quite as they portrayed it. Um, and
So
as far as the presence of the Secret Service of the KGB and those guys, I I don't think that it was unreasonable because the Gorbachev himself has been interviewed after the fact, and he stated that yeah, he had these top scientists followed, and so that he could keep tabs on them. Like that is a matter of public record.
yeah,
As to whether people were afraid of being executed and things like that, I don't know if that was still going on, but I imagine people were still afraid because everybody, it was still a repressive regime. Sure, the sunshine was starting to burst through slowly, but people have lived under this tyrannical rule for, well, some of them for as long as they can remember. So, like, I don't see that as an irrational fear to have.
yeah. Well, I don't know. Historically, this was a show trial, and I think that was one of the things he said was like these show trials. This looked like it looked in the 30s, like the way they portrayed it on the screen. So there's a big public trial where the conclusion is already predetermined. and the people who have already been assigned guilt even before the trial begins will eventually be shot. And he's saying like that is not accurate to that time period.
Oh, but nobody was shot, right? And the show hasn't claimed that they were sentenced to prison term, right? And they served it.
Yeah.
But I do recall that in the podcast with the maker of the show where he talked about some of the elements of this of that proceeding, he actually borrowed from a much earlier, I think it was like from the 50s or something, where they were doing a trial. At the very beginning, there was like this guy doing an announcement about what this trial is about and how it's supposed to be to bring about the prosperity of the Soviet state, and like that sort of indoctrination speech that he did at the very beginning. Like they weren't doing that at that time anymore, but he wanted to include that as part of kind of a, I guess, as part of painting a picture of how the state was run, certainly at an earlier point.
Yeah, I can understand wanting to include that, but I can also kind of understand why you'd have to expect Russia, even modern day Russia, to be somewhat annoyed by this if it is an overrepresentation of what was going on in the 80s. And I say that like I'm fascinated by how corrupt the Soviet system was. I'm fascinated and horrified, like from reading a chunk of the Gulag Archipelago about just how messed up it was in the 30s and all the people they imprisoned and killed unfairly, millions of people. So I'm fascinated by it, but I still want to walk away with like an accurate understanding of what it was like in the 80s. So if you are going to like portray the corruption of a country and you're going to overdo it, you're bound to piss off that country a little bit. Like, can you imagine if, like, the U.S. has its problems too, right? But can you imagine if a Russian-made film or a film made elsewhere portrayed the U.S. in such a way that they ramped up that corruption to a degree that's not fair or that's not accurate to that time? You're going to piss off American critics.
I imagine there's going to be a contingent of people who are going to be unhappy for sure. But the thing is that, like I think that the cool thing about America is that it, at least to a degree, I'd say it has been fairly self-critical, at least from the cinematic perspective, where, people would make movies about how things were mismanaged and how whether it was the collapse of the economy in 2008 with the Big Short and the things like that. So exposés of corruption, whether it be in government or big business or the combination of both, certainly isn't off limits to American cinema. Yes. Whereas I feel like in more repressive places, Russia being an example at the moment, that sort of portrayal simply won't fly.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. But of course, there is a difference too between American-made films criticizing America versus like if it was made in another nation. Not to say that the response would be as bad. There's no equivocating Russia and the U.S. because Russia is obviously way more repressive and would respond to internal critiques harshly, but there's still a difference there. Like this was made by British filmmakers and actors about the Russian system, so you're gonna get a different kind of response, right?
No, I think that's fair, and I think there's certainly a lot of that kind of reactivity that you can find in videos online where people who feel their national identity has been put in question and unduly tarnished, and certainly that that evokes a lot of strong emotions and condemnation, and And I suppose to a degree it's warranted, but also ultimately I think it is misguided.
Mm. Yeah. Well, for me as the viewer, I just want to walk away from, like, I would consider this historical. I don't know, historical fiction. I don't know what to call it, but definitely like the historical element is a big part of what riveted me to it. So um, I want to walk away with like, okay, now I understand better what happened. Holy hell, that was a crazy time in history. But now learning that some of this stuff may have been exaggerated, it's like, oh, okay, now I don't really know what I experienced there. It's like question marked. It remains to be sorted out. I guess it's more of like an invitation to read into the history and learn the actual history.
Well, what I think I experienced there was a display of courage of the individual people who took upon themselves the burden of solving the problem, and the cowardice of some of the people who were in power, uh, who were more interested in saving their own asses than anything else. And I think that story was well told. You know, whether some of the facts um, were exaggerated or not. Like, to me, it's almost besides the point. Like, because I'm not, you know, like I wasn't looking at it as a documentary account, although I feel like it portrayed the uh, the overall feel of the era um, fairly well, and
Mm.
and yeah, man, I guess that's all I can really expect from a film like this.
Hmm. Yeah, if they, I presume, yeah, if that is all true, which I imagine it is, like the general theme there of cowardice versus courage and responsibility. I'm sure that's probably true, regardless of the details.